The morning of August 8, 1944, near the town of Mortagne in northwestern France. Soberscharfer Ernst Barkmann sat in the commander's cupola of his Panther tank, watching through his optics as an American Sherman crested a hill approximately 800 meters distant. He gave the order. His gunner fired. The armor-piercing round struck the Sherman's turret at a shallow angle, penetrating the armor and detonating inside. Smoke poured from the hatches. The crew bailed out, running for cover. Barkmann marked the kill in his log, his third Sherman that morning. 3 hours later, Barkmann's unit advanced through the same sector. Movement caught his eye. The same Sherman. He recognized the unit markings. The pattern of additional track links welded to the hull for extra protection was backing into a hedgerow, its gun traversing toward his position. Impossible. He'd watched that tank burn. Yet there it was, fighting again. By nightfall, Barkmann would encounter that Sherman a third time. Each time, he would knock it out. Each time, it would return to battle. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was happening across every front where American and German armor met. German tankers began speaking in hushed tones about the Wiedergänger, the Revenant, the ghost tank that refused to stay dead. The German military had spent years perfecting the art of armored warfare. Their Panther and Tiger tanks were marvels of engineering. Powerful guns, thick armor, sophisticated optics. On paper, they were superior to the American M4 Sherman in nearly every measurable way. German tankers knew this. They could reliably destroy Shermans at ranges where the American tanks couldn't effectively return fire. The kill ratios seemed to prove German superiority. 5 Shermans destroyed for every German tank lost. Sometimes more. But the Germans were losing the war. They couldn't understand it. Every engagement report told the same story. German tanks dominated the battlefield tactically. They destroyed American armor in devastating numbers. Yet somehow, impossibly, there were always more Shermans. Always. The Americans seemed to have an infinite supply. German commanders pleaded for reinforcements that never came, while American tank battalions that had been decimated 1 week returned to full strength the next. The answer wasn't in the quality of the tanks. It was in something far more fundamental, something that revealed a profound difference in how the two nations understood modern warfare. The Germans had built their tanks like medieval cathedrals, masterpieces of craftsmanship, each one unique, irreplaceable. The Americans had built theirs like Ford Model TS, simple, standardized, and most importantly, fixable. This is the story of how industrial philosophy won the greatest armored conflict in history. It's about the Sherman tank, the most underrated weapon of World War II, and the revolutionary approach to warfare that it represented. When the M4 Sherman first entered combat in North Africa in 1942, it was actually a competitive tank. Against the German Panzer IIIs and early Panzer IVs it faced in Tunisia, the Sherman performed admirably. Its 75mm gun could penetrate German armor at combat ranges. Its armor could withstand most German anti-tank weapons. American tankers felt confident in their machines. Then came Normandy. Then came the Panthers and Tigers. The Panther tank mounted a 75mm gun that was far more powerful than anything the Americans had encountered. Its sloped armor, when struck at proper angles, could deflect even the American 76mm high-velocity rounds that were introduced later in the war. The Tiger's 88mm gun could destroy a Sherman from distances exceeding 2,000 meters, ranges at which the Sherman couldn't even effectively see the Tiger, let alone hit it. American tankers learned to fear the distinctive sound of an 88 firing, a crack so sharp and immediate that you heard the impact before you heard the shot. If you heard it, you were lucky. It meant the round had missed or struck another tank. The men who weren't lucky simply ceased to exist in a flash of fire and metal. Staff Sergeant Lafayette Poole, one of the most successful American tank commanders of the war, once described the experience of facing a tiger. You'd hear the crack, and someone's tank would just erupt, flames shooting 50 feet in the air. You knew those boys were dead before they even knew they'd been hit. And you absolutely knew, that you couldn't hurt that thing at this range. All you could do was move, try to close the distance, pray you got lucky. The British had a name for the Sherman. They called it the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter whose advertising slogan was, "Lights first time, every time." American tankers called it the Zippo for the same reason. The Sherman's gasoline engine and ammunition storage made it prone to catastrophic fires when penetrated. German tankers had their own name for it, Tommy Coker, the Tommy Cooker. The psychological impact was devastating. American tankers knew they were climbing into machines that were outgunned, out-armored, and liable to burn like torches when hit. Each mission meant facing German tanks that could kill you from ranges where you couldn't fight back. The stress manifested in 1,000 small ways. Men who couldn't sleep. Men who jumped at sudden noises. Men who volunteered for infantry duty rather than face another day in a Sherman. Lieutenant Belton Cooper, an ordnance officer responsible for tank recovery and repair, witnessed the aftermath of dozens of Sherman vs. Panther engagements. His memoirs contain descriptions that are difficult to read: burned bodies fused to metal, turrets blown 30 feet from their hulls, the peculiar smell that hung over destroyed tanks. He calculated that the average lifespan of a Sherman in combat during the Normandy campaign was approximately 16 days. Yet here's what the Germans couldn't understand. Those destroyed Shermans? Most of them would fight again. Within hours, sometimes. The German approach to tank design emphasized quality and capability. Each Panther tank required approximately 55,000 man-hours to produce. The Germans used labor-intensive construction methods, extensive welding, complex interlocking armor plates, precision-machined components. Each tank was, in a sense, a custom product. Parts from one Panther often wouldn't fit properly in another, even if they were produced in the same factory. Minor variations in manufacturing meant that field repairs often required customized solutions. When a Panther was knocked out, getting it back into action was a nightmare. If the damage was significant, the tank often had to be transported all the way back to Germany for repairs. This could take weeks or months. The repair facilities were themselves targets for Allied bombing. As the war progressed and Germany's industrial capacity was degraded, tanks that would have been reparable in 1942 became permanent losses in 1944. Each destroyed Panther represented 55,000 man-hours that could never be recovered. The Tiger was even worse. At approximately 300,000 man-hours per tank, each Tiger represented an enormous investment of labor and materials. When one was destroyed, Germany lost not just a tank but the equivalent of 150 workers laboring for a full year. By late 1944, Germany was producing approximately 25 Tigers per month. They were losing them faster than that. The Americans took a completely different approach. The Sherman was designed from the beginning around a revolutionary concept: modular construction and interchangeable parts. Henry Ford's assembly line philosophy applied to armored warfare. A Sherman required approximately 10,000 man-hours to produce, 1/5 the time of a Panther, 1/30th the time of a Tiger. But the real genius wasn't in the production time. It was in what happened after production. Every component of a Sherman was standardized. The engine from a tank built in Detroit would fit perfectly in a tank built in Chicago. The transmission from one Sherman could be swapped into another in the field. Suspension bogies, road wheels, track links, gun barrels, turret drives, every single component was designed to be quickly removable and replaceable with no custom fitting required. American ordnance units were supplied with massive quantities of spare parts. A single maintenance company supporting an armored division might carry 50 extra engines, 30 transmissions, hundreds of road wheels and track links, dozens of gun barrels. They carried cutting torches, welding equipment, hoists, jacks, and specialized tools designed specifically for Sherman maintenance. Most remarkably, they carried complete spare modules. Need a new engine? Don't repair the damaged one. Just unbolt it and drop in a new one. The entire operation could be completed in 4 hours by a trained crew. Damaged transmission? 3 hours to swap it out. Gun barrel worn out from firing? 90 minutes to replace it. Lieutenant Colonel William Orr commanded a tank maintenance battalion during the campaign in Northwest Europe. He later wrote, "The Sherman was a mechanic's dream. Everything was accessible. Everything came apart logically. Everything fit back together the way it was supposed to. We could completely rebuild a tank in less time than it took to submit the paperwork." The true power of the American system revealed itself in the aftermath of combat. When an armored engagement ended, the Germans would count their kills and consider the battle won. The Americans would count their losses and begin the recovery operation. Tank recovery was its own specialized operation. Armored recovery vehicles, essentially Shermans with their turrets removed and heavy winches installed, would move onto the battlefield as soon as the shooting stopped, sometimes before. Their crews worked under fire, hooking cables to knocked out Shermans and dragging them back to collection points behind the lines. The assessment process was ruthlessly efficient. Tanks were triaged into 3 categories. Category 1, minor damage, can be repaired at collection point. Category 2, major damage, requires evacuation to maintenance battalion. Category 3, catastrophic damage, strip for parts and scrap the hull. But here's what terrified German intelligence officers when they studied captured American maintenance manuals. The American definition of catastrophic damage was almost unimaginably narrow. A tank that had been hit 6 times, burned, had its turret blown off, and been abandoned by its crew was not necessarily Category 3. If the hull was intact and the engine compartment wasn't melted, it could be rebuilt. During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, First Lieutenant Frank Audefred commanded a maintenance platoon supporting the 3rd Armored Division. His unit's records survive, and they're remarkable. In a 2-week period, his platoon of 30 men returned 47 Shermans to combat operations. 17 of those tanks had been classified as complete losses by their crews. 1 Sherman had been hit by 4 armor-piercing rounds, caught fire, had its ammunition cook off, and was found with all 4 crew members dead inside. Audefred's men stripped it to the hull, replaced the entire powertrain, installed a new turret from a different tank, rewired it completely, and had it back in action within 5 days. The German equivalent would have been to write the tank off entirely and request a replacement from Germany. The replacement would arrive in 6 to 8 weeks, if at all. Consider the mathematics of this system. In a typical engagement, an American tank battalion might lose 15 Shermans knocked out or abandoned. Within 24 hours, 10 of those would be back in action, engines replaced, track damage repaired, armor patches welded on. Within 72 hours, another 4 would return. Only 1 would be considered a permanent loss. From the American perspective, they'd lost 1 tank. From the German perspective, they'd destroyed 15 tanks but were now facing 14 of them again. It was psychologically devastating. SS Hauptsturmführer Michael Wittmann, Germany's most celebrated tank ace with 138 confirmed kills, reportedly told fellow officers after an engagement in Normandy, "I don't understand. We destroyed an entire American company this morning. 15 tanks, absolutely destroyed. This afternoon, they came back with 14 tanks. Some of them had the same markings, the same damage patterns. How are they doing this?" German tankers began to dread the American maintenance capability more than American firepower. You could destroy a Sherman. You could watch it burn. But you could never be certain it was truly dead. Tomorrow, it might be fighting you again. The system worked because it was designed holistically. Every step, from initial design to battlefield recovery to depot maintenance, was integrated into a comprehensive philosophy. The Sherman wasn't just a tank. It was the centerpiece of an entire industrial and logistical system designed to keep armor fighting. Maintenance units operated with assembly line efficiency. A damaged Sherman arriving at a collection point would be swarmed by specialists. One team handled the powertrain. Another handled the running gear. A third worked on the turret and gun. They worked simultaneously, not sequentially. A tank that would take one crew 3 days to repair could be finished in 10 hours by coordinated teams. The spare part supply system was equally sophisticated. Every part was assigned a standardized number. A maintenance unit could radio in a parts request using those numbers, and the requested components would arrive by truck within hours. The supply chain stretched back through division supply points, core depots, Army-level facilities, all the way to stateside production. When a Sherman in France needed a new final drive, the request could trigger production of a replacement in Detroit almost automatically. German forces had captured numerous Shermans during the fighting. Some were pressed into German service. The Germans were desperate enough for tanks to use anything they could get running. German engineers thoroughly examined these captured vehicles, took them apart, studied the design philosophy. Reports were written. Recommendations were made. The reports were fascinating. German engineers praised the Sherman's reliability, its ease of maintenance, its logical design. They noted how the entire engine could be removed as a single unit. They marveled at the interchangeability of parts. They documented the clever accessibility features, how you could reach critical components without removing half the tank. Then came the recommendations. Germany should adopt similar principles. Future German tank designs should emphasize maintainability. Production should focus on standardization and interchangeable parts. The reports were detailed, specific, practical. They were also completely ignored. The German armaments industry was incapable of implementing American production philosophy. It wasn't a matter of will or understanding. It was structural. German tank production was distributed among multiple manufacturers, each with their own traditions and methods. Henschel built Tigers differently than Porsche built them. The Panthers from MAN differed in small but significant ways from those produced by Daimler-Benz. Consolidating these approaches would have required shutting down production lines and retooling factories. Impossible when you're losing the war and desperate for any tanks you can produce. More fundamentally, the German approach to engineering was philosophically different. German engineers prided themselves on producing the best possible product, the most powerful gun, the thickest armor, the most sophisticated optics. Compromise was considered failure. The idea of deliberately designing something to be good enough rather than the best was almost offensive. The Americans understood something the Germans didn't. In industrial warfare, perfection is the enemy of effectiveness. A tank that takes 5 times longer to build and 10 times longer to repair might win individual battles, but it will lose the war. The Sherman wasn't the best tank in World War II. It was the most effective one. By the spring of 1945, the mathematics of tank warfare had become clear, and they were brutal for Germany. American armored divisions were operating with 90% or higher operational readiness rates, meaning that 90% of their tanks were combat capable at any given time. German units were lucky to achieve 50%. Often it was lower. This wasn't because German tanks were less reliable, though they were. It was because when a German tank broke down, even from simple mechanical failure, it often stayed broken. A Tiger with a damaged transmission might sit immobile for weeks waiting for a replacement that was being manufactured in a factory that had been bombed the night before. A Sherman with the same problem would be running again before the Tiger's crew finished their paperwork. The advantage compounded over time. Every month, German armored strength decreased not just from combat losses but from the accumulation of damaged vehicles that couldn't be repaired. American armored strength remained relatively constant despite heavy combat losses, because the repair system kept returning tanks to service. During the final drive into Germany, there are documented instances of American armored units facing German forces that included American-made Sherman tanks. The Germans were so desperate for armored vehicles that they pressed captured Shermans into service. The irony was painful. These Shermans, fighting under German control, were more reliable and easier to maintain than the German tanks fighting beside them. One captured German maintenance officer, interrogated after his unit surrendered in April 1945, provided remarkable testimony. He stated that his unit had been assigned 6 Panthers and 3 captured Shermans. Over a 3-month period, the Panthers averaged 35% operational readiness. The Shermans, maintained with salvaged American parts and improvised repairs, averaged 80%. If we could have had an entire battalion of captured American tanks, he said, we might have lasted longer. They were simply better machines for the conditions we faced. The operational impact extended beyond availability rates. American commanders could plan operations knowing their tanks would be there. German commanders had to plan around the assumption that half their armor might not start tomorrow. This fundamental reliability difference affected strategy, tactics, and morale at every level. Statistically, American armored divisions destroyed or captured approximately 14,000 German armored fighting vehicles during the war in Europe. American tank losses were approximately 18,000 vehicles. But, and this is the critical number, only about 6,000 American tanks were permanent losses. The other 12,000 were repaired and returned to service, many of them multiple times. Germany produced approximately 6,000 Panthers during the entire war. They produced approximately 1,350 Tigers. These impressive machines, technological marvels that outperformed their American counterparts in direct combat, were defeated not by better tanks but by a better system. The impact wasn't limited to the European theater. In the Pacific, where logistics were even more challenging, the Sherman's maintainability proved equally valuable. Island hopping campaigns meant that repair facilities had to be portable and could only carry limited supplies. The Sherman's standardized parts and modular design made it possible to maintain armored forces thousands of miles from home. Japanese tank forces, equipped with lighter vehicles that were inferior to even the Sherman's relatively modest capabilities, faced not just better individual tanks but an entire support system they couldn't match. A damaged Japanese tank on a Pacific island was likely to become a permanent loss. A damaged Sherman would be pulled back, repaired, and fighting again. The lessons were absorbed by military planners worldwide. Post-war tank design across all nations incorporated elements of the Sherman's maintainability philosophy. The Soviet T-54, the British Centurion, even later German designs, all showed the influence of American maintenance-focused engineering. But the immediate impact, in 1944 and 1945, was operational victory. German forces that might have held defensive positions longer, that might have counterattacked more effectively, that might have prolonged the war, found themselves unable to sustain armored operations. Not because they lacked skilled crews or tactical doctrine, but because they couldn't keep their magnificent machines running. The Sherman's true legacy isn't measured in gun calibers or armor thickness. It's measured in a fundamental shift in how militaries understood the relationship between quality and quantity, between engineering excellence and operational effectiveness. Before World War II, military thought emphasized the importance of superior equipment. The nation with better weapons would win. This seemed logical. It was also incomplete. The Sherman demonstrated that the nation with adequate weapons that could be maintained, repaired, and kept fighting would defeat the nation with superior weapons that spent half their time broken down. This lesson influenced Cold War military planning profoundly. The United States designed its main battle tanks, the M48, M60, and later the M1 Abrams, with maintainability as a primary design consideration. The Abrams can have its entire power pack removed and replaced in less than 30 minutes by a trained crew. This wasn't accidental. This was the Sherman's philosophy, refined and perfected. The Soviet Union learned similar lessons. The T-54 and its descendants were deliberately designed for ease of production and maintenance. Soviet military doctrine emphasized keeping large numbers of adequate tanks operational rather than small numbers of sophisticated ones. They'd fought alongside American Sherman units during the war and seen the system work. Even Germany, in its post-war rearmament, adopted American maintenance philosophy. The Leopard 1 and Leopard 2 main battle tanks, designed and built in Germany, incorporated modular construction and standardized parts. The engineering culture that produced the Tiger had been replaced by pragmatic understanding of modern warfare's realities. Yet the Sherman itself has been historically underrated. Popular history often focuses on its disadvantages, its relative weakness compared to German heavy tanks, its vulnerability to fire, the unfortunate nicknames given it by crews. What's overlooked is that the Sherman won. Not occasionally. Consistently. Everywhere it fought. The Sherman served in more armies worldwide than any other tank of its era. Beyond American and British service, Shermans were used by Free French forces, Canadian units, Polish forces, Soviet units, South American nations, and later by Israeli forces in their War of Independence. This widespread adoption wasn't accidental. Nations chose the Sherman because it worked, because it could be maintained, because spare parts were available, because their mechanics could keep it running. In Israel's 1948 War of Independence, Sherman tanks, some salvaged from British dumps, others purchased as scrap and rebuilt, formed the core of Israeli armored forces. These tanks were decades old, had been through World War II, and were fighting again. The fact that they could be restored to combat effectiveness after sitting in a scrapyard for 3 years speaks to the fundamental soundness of their design. The maintenance philosophy pioneered with the Sherman extended beyond military applications. Post-war industrial design across multiple sectors was influenced by the lessons learned. The idea that products should be designed for repair, that parts should be standardized and interchangeable, that maintenance should be considered during initial design rather than as an afterthought, these concepts became fundamental to modern manufacturing. The Sherman was produced in larger numbers than any other American tank of World War II, approximately 50,000 units. This production total is often cited as evidence of quantity over quality. But consider this alternative interpretation. The Sherman was produced in those numbers because the design was efficient enough to allow that level of production while still maintaining quality. Germany couldn't have built 50,000 Panthers even if they'd had unlimited resources and time. The design was too complex, too labor-intensive, too dependent on skilled craftsmen. The philosophical difference can be summarized simply. German engineering asked, "What is the best tank we can build?" American engineering asked, "What is the most effective tank we can build, maintain, and keep fighting?" These are fundamentally different questions, and they produced fundamentally different answers. Understanding this difference illuminates broader patterns in how nations approach technological competition. Throughout the Cold War and into the present, military procurement has struggled with the tension between capability and practicality. Do you buy fewer expensive, highly capable systems, or more numerous, adequate systems? The Sherman's legacy suggests that for sustained operations, the latter approach is often more effective. Modern military logistics still grapple with the challenges the Sherman's designers solved. How do you maintain complex equipment in hostile territory far from industrial bases? How do you keep repair time short enough that damaged equipment returns before it becomes obsolete? How do you design systems that can be maintained by average technicians rather than specialists? These questions remain relevant because the fundamental realities of warfare haven't changed. Distance matters. Time matters. The ability to repair what's broken matters. The Sherman succeeded not by being invincible but by being fixable. That's a less dramatic legacy than "we had the best tank," but it's a more important one. The men who crewed Shermans developed a complex relationship with their machines. They knew the tank's weaknesses intimately. They'd lost friends to those weaknesses. Yet they also came to trust the fundamental reliability of the vehicle, its mechanical dependability, the knowledge that if something broke, it could be fixed. Sergeant Curtis Cullen, a tanker in the 2nd Armored Division, kept a diary throughout the campaign in Northwest Europe. His entry from July 1944 captures this ambivalence perfectly. Got hit again today. 3rd time for this particular tank. Engine fire, but the boys got it out before the ammunition cooked off. Maintenance had us running again by evening. I hate this machine and I love it. Hate it because it's a death trap. Love it because it keeps coming back. Just like us. The maintenance crews developed their own esprit de corps. They worked brutal hours, 16, 18, sometimes 24-hour shifts when heavy combat produced waves of damaged vehicles. They worked in mud, in darkness, in the cold. They operated within artillery range, sometimes under direct fire. Their reward was seeing tanks they'd repaired roll back into action, knowing that the repairs they'd made might save the lives of crews they'd never meet. Private First Class Robert Early, a mechanic in an ordnance maintenance company, wrote home in August 1944 about the satisfaction of his work. "Ma, you know how you'd fix Dad's car and he'd be so grateful he couldn't stop thanking you? It's like that, except instead of Dad, it's a tank crew who knows their lives depend on whether I do my job right. We got one tank back fighting that had been hit so many times the crew called it Lazarus. Watching it drive away, knowing I helped bring it back, that's something." Tank crews often personalize their vehicles, giving them names, painting artwork on the hulls. This practice is well documented. What's less discussed is how often the same name and artwork would appear on multiple tanks. When a tank was destroyed, the crew, if they survived, would take their name and number to their next assignment. Maintenance crews would help them paint it on the new hull, sometimes salvaging the actual plate from the destroyed tank. This created a strange continuity. Big Red might be destroyed in June, but Big Red would be fighting again in July, crewed by the same men in a technically different tank. To the crew, it was the same vehicle, brought back from the dead. To the Germans facing them, it was incomprehensible. They'd destroyed that tank. They knew they had. Yet there it was again. The psychological impact on German crews was significant. After the war, numerous German veterans spoke about the demoralization of facing American armor. It wasn't the individual combat engagements. German tankers generally felt confident in their tactical superiority. It was the grinding realization that tactical victories didn't matter. They could win every engagement and still lose the battle, because the Americans would always have more tanks tomorrow. Oberfeldwebel Hans Becker, a Panther commander who survived the war, provided testimony during post-war interviews that reveals this demoralization. You would destroy 5, 6, sometimes 10 American tanks in a day. You would return to your position feeling victorious. But the next day, there would be just as many. Where were they coming from? We knew we were producing perhaps 20, 30 new Panthers per month for the entire front. We would destroy twice that many American tanks in a single engagement. Yet they had more the next day. It broke something inside us, that knowledge. American tankers also struggled with the psychological toll of combat, but their burden was different. They feared the engagement itself, the moment of vulnerability when a German gun fired and you didn't know if you'd survive the next second. But they didn't fear the larger strategic picture. They knew reinforcements were coming. They knew damaged tanks would be repaired. They knew the system supported them. This psychological difference, confidence in the system versus doubt about eventual victory, affected morale at every level. German units fought with increasing desperation, knowing that each loss was permanent, that they were growing weaker while the enemy grew stronger. American units fought with the assurance that setbacks were temporary, that losses would be made good, that time was on their side. The maintenance crews themselves faced psychological challenges. They worked on tanks they knew were death traps, trying to make them safe for crews who'd be climbing back in tomorrow. They pulled bodies from burned-out hulls, collected personal effects to send home to families, then returned those same hulls to service with new crews. The psychological compartmentalization required for this work was immense. Yet the maintenance companies developed fierce pride in their abilities. Competition between units to see who could return tanks to service fastest became common. Records were kept and bragged about. A company that could consistently get knocked out tanks fighting again within 12 hours earned respect throughout the division. Technical Sergeant William Fry, who supervised a maintenance platoon during the drive across France, later reflected on this period with a mixture of pride and sorrow. We were good at what we did. The best. We could take a tank that looked like scrap metal and have it fighting again in a day. Saved lives. Probably thousands of them over the course of the war. But sometimes I think about it, we sent men back into battle in tanks we just pulled dead men out of. Cleaned the blood off the seats, patched the holes, sent new crews in. That part haunts me still. The relationship between tank crews and maintenance crews was built on mutual dependence and respect. Crews knew their lives depended on the quality of repairs. Maintenance teams knew that their work directly affected combat outcomes. This created bonds that survived long after the war. Reunions of armored divisions invariably included maintenance personnel, often honored as much as combat veterans. One Sherman crew in particular exemplifies the resilience of both the tank and the system supporting it. The crew of Cobra King, commanded by Lieutenant Charles Boggess, fought from Normandy through the Battle of the Bulge. Their tank was knocked out 4 times, repaired 4 times. They were the first American unit to break through to the encircled forces at Bastogne during the Bulge. When asked how they kept fighting after being knocked out repeatedly, Boggess gave a simple answer. The tank kept coming back. So we kept coming back. That was the deal. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. By that point, the German armored forces that had seemed invincible in 1940 had been ground down to insignificance. The vaunted panzer divisions existed mostly on paper. The few remaining tanks sat immobile, out of fuel, broken down, abandoned. The mechanical sophistication that was supposed to deliver victory had instead delivered defeat. American Sherman tanks rolled into Berlin, into the heart of the Reich that had designed the world's most powerful tanks. Those Shermans were battered, scarred, repaired multiple times. Some had been destroyed and rebuilt so many times their maintenance records resembled resurrection narratives. They'd been outperformed in individual combat countless times. Yet they'd won. The deeper lesson transcends armor warfare. Organizations, nations, and systems compete not just on peak performance but on sustainability. The ability to absorb damage, to recover quickly, to maintain operations despite setbacks. These capabilities often matter more than theoretical superiority. The Sherman tank was designed by engineers who understood that war isn't a single engagement but a sustained campaign. They built a machine that could lose battles and still win wars. They created a system where tactical defeats became strategic victories because the damage could be restored and returned to fight again. German military culture emphasized the decisive battle, the knockout blow, the overwhelming application of superior force at the critical point. This worked brilliantly when it worked. But when it didn't work, when the battle became an extended campaign of attrition, the German system had no answer. American military culture, shaped by industrial experience and continental distances, emphasized sustainability, logistics, and the long game. The Sherman embodied this philosophy. It wasn't designed to win duels. It was designed to win campaigns. This philosophical difference applies beyond military history. In any competitive endeavor, business, technology, geopolitics, the question arises, do you optimize for peak performance or sustainable effectiveness? The Sherman suggests an answer. Build systems that can fail and recover. Design for maintenance, not just for initial capability. Accept that good enough reliably beats excellent occasionally. The Sherman story challenges our cultural preference for technological superiority narratives. We want to believe that better technology wins. It's cleaner, simpler, more satisfying than the messy reality that operational logistics, maintenance systems, and industrial capacity often matter more than the specifications of individual weapons. Thousands of Sherman tanks still exist worldwide. Some are in museums, restored to pristine condition. Others are rusting in fields, monuments to battles long past. A few are still operational, maintained by collectors and military historians. Their survival rate is far higher than German tanks from the same era. For the same reason they survived the war. They were built to last, built to be maintained, built to keep going. The men who crewed and maintained these tanks are disappearing now, the way the generation that fought the war inevitably must. Their stories, the first-hand accounts of what it meant to fight in and repair these machines, are becoming history rather than living memory. But the lessons they learned, paid for in blood and sweat and tears, remain relevant. In a world that increasingly values sophistication and cutting-edge capability, the Sherman reminds us that resilience matters. The ability to take damage and keep functioning. The capacity to be repaired by average mechanics with standard tools. The philosophy that accepts limitations in exchange for reliability. The German tankers who fought against Shermans were right. They did have better tanks. But they lost anyway. Not because American tanks were secretly superior, but because American tank doctrine, American maintenance philosophy, American industrial organization, and American logistical systems created an integrated whole that German technical excellence couldn't overcome. That's the story that deserves to be remembered. Not the myth of the invincible German tiger or the underdog Sherman, but the reality of how industrial warfare actually works. How systems matter more than components. How sustainability beats sophistication. How the tank that keeps coming back defeats the tank that doesn't, regardless of which one wins the individual engagement. The Sherman wasn't the best tank of World War II. It was something more important. It was the most effective one. And in war, as in life, effectiveness ultimately matters more than excellence. The ghost tanks that German crews feared, the Shermans that refused to stay dead, they taught that lesson at terrible cost. We should remember why they kept returning to battle. Not because they were unkillable, but because someone would always bring them back.